Welcome to lesson number 7. We're talking about general revelation, answering the question, what is going to happen in the future? We've covered several topics, things so far. What we're looking at now is the various issues during the tribulation. We've finished the last event of the church age, the rapture, and we talked a little of the Antichrist, and now we want to cover some of just the general overview, people, events, that type of thing that will be during the tribulation time. And then we'll later, in lesson number 9 and 10 and 11, we'll get into some of the various specific events of the tribulation, and we'll talk about the Holy Spirit, Israel, the Battle of Armageddon, and then the return of Christ, the millennium, and on into eternity. So some of the overview of events, I want to look at 4 things in this lesson. We'll talk about a covenant that is going to be made at the beginning of the tribulation. We'll look at the government situation during the tribulation, what is called the false prophet, the second beast that we'll look at. And then we'll conclude with the topic looking at a one world church. So let's first start looking at this covenant. We've mentioned it before in Daniel chapter 9 and verses 27. It kind of introduced it in verse 26. Verse 27 says, "He will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7." This is the first event of the tribulation. It is the thing that will start the clock for the 7-year period. And it's talking here about he. In order to discern who that is, we need to go back to verse 26. And in verse 26, it talked about the people of the prince who is to come. That prince, as we mentioned in our last lecture, is the Antichrist. From 1 John, it uses that word, and then in Revelation, it talks about that first beast. He is going to be a world ruler of a one world government. Those are some of the things that we're going to talk about, but what he's saying here, what Daniel is revealing to us here, is that he is going to set up, he's going to confirm a covenant. And it says that it will be for 1/7. Again, if you remember from previous lectures, we talked about Daniel's 70 weeks, and we said that each of those 7 weeks was a 7-year period of time, and the 69th week ended basically back in the time of Christ, when he entered into Jerusalem and was hailed as the king. Though a week later he was killed on a cross, but it left 1/7, 1 week left. And that's what this verse is talking about, that 70th week of Daniel. So it will be a 7-year period of time that is yet coming in the future. Now, this covenant, it's an agreement that's being made. It's not known what the topic of that covenant would be. The Jews at this particular time are surrounded by enemies, so it may have to do with some kind of a peace agreement. There's also a great desire for the Jews to rebuild their own temple, but the Mosque of Omar is now sitting in that place, so it may have something to do with that temple and the potential rebuilding of that temple. But we don't know what this covenant is going to be. But I do want us to understand what a covenant is talking about. A covenant is a legal contract. into which one enters and by which his course of action is bound. The idea of a covenant, of making a covenant, is a very familiar topic in the Old Testament. In Genesis 9, God made a covenant with Noah. In Genesis 15 and 17, he made a covenant with Abraham. And in 2 Samuel 7, God made a covenant with David. And so this binding agreement, this legal contract in which one enters, and his course of action then is bound as to what's going to happen. It's a relationship between two partners who make binding promises to each other, and then they work towards reaching that common goal. There are often covenants in the Old Testament were often accompanied by various oaths and signs and ceremonies. But the covenant itself defined the obligations and the commitments that were being made. And the covenant was a very relational kind of agreement, much more than a contract today. Think of the marriage covenant between a man and a wife, that they choose to enter into this formal relationship, binding themselves to one another in faithfulness and working as partners toward a common goal, like building a life or raising children, a family. Now, some covenants that God set up have conditions, and others are what we would call unconditional. Some of the covenants were one-sided covenants, promises made by one of the partners of the covenant, where the other partner is not bound, is irrespective of the actions of the other partner. So this is the idea of a covenant. It will be the first event that is going to take place at the very beginning of the tribulation time. Now, another characteristic of this period of time is that there will be a one world government. We can see this in Daniel chapter 7. After that, in my night vision at night, I looked. There before me was a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. Now, the interpretation of this vision that Daniel saw, this beast that he saw, he's describing it here, but the interpretation of what this fourth beast is given to us in verses 23 to 25. Daniel asked in verse 19, he was perplexed about this fourth beast, and so he wanted to know what it was. He didn't ask about the first 3 beasts, but only this fourth one. It said in verse 19, then I, speaking of Daniel, desired to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others. So verses 23 to 25 describe that fourth beast. Thus he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms. And it will, notice the area, it will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones, and will subdue 3 kings, and he will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the Highest One, and he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. So out of this kingdom that he's talking about here, this fourth beast is actually a kingdom, it says in verse 23. So out of this kingdom is going to come 10 horns, and those 10 horns will be 10 kings that are going to come out of that fourth kingdom. And then in verse 24, it talks about another horn that's going to arise, that's different from the others. That he's going to, it says, subdue 3 kings. He's going to uproot 3 of those horns. And thus those kingdoms, those 3 kings, are somehow going to be subdued, likely dethroned, and likely killed. And he's going to be speaking against the Most High. So he's blaspheming God, and he will wear down the saints. In other words, he's going to be fighting, attacking believers. So it's talking here about a one world government. We see this also in the New Testament, very similar language in Revelation 17. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, and they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. That beast is the other horn that Daniel saw. These have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. So these 10 kings will combine their authority and give that authority to the beast, and thus the beast will wage war against the Lamb, but it says that the Lamb will overcome them because he is the Lord of lords and King of kings. And those who are with him are the called and chosen and faithful. We see it also in Revelation 13. And it was given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to him. Thus it is a one world government that will be led by the Antichrist. Now it's interesting that in the world today, there's discussion about this, what today they are calling global governance. This is a book that is available. It's on the topic that's coming out of Europe, and they don't call it a one world government, but that topic is being discussed today, and thus I believe that the very beginnings of what will be needed and what will take place during the tribulation is forming today. The attitude of governments that there's an interdependence economically. If one country, when the U.S. suffered financially, the whole world was affected, and there's an interconnectedness, an interwoven challenges. We saw that with COVID, how one nation handles an issue affects all nations. So there are these interwoven domestic and foreign challenges that is causing the world to look towards this idea of a one world government. A third topic we want to look at is the false prophet. We see this in Revelation chapter 13. In the first part of that chapter, it talked about a beast. We identified that beast as the Antichrist, but that chapter goes on to talk about another beast. He says in verse 11, I saw another beast coming out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. He made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And he performed great and miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of man. This is a religious leader. He's going to cause all of the inhabitants of the earth to worship this first beast, the Antichrist. Now, let's go on and look at the next verses. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth. He was described in the verses before as a lamb, and yet he spoke like a dragon. And he's going to use signs that are going to be performed in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast. And there was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast might even speak, and cause as many as do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. And thus we see this false prophet directing the whole world to worship the beast. And in order to prove that he is truly a prophet, he does miraculous things. They make an image of the beast, and that piece of wood or whatever, however they construct it, it was able to come alive. It was able to actually speak, to breathe. And it caused any who did not worship that image of the beast to be killed. Now, today we talk about what we call the ecumenical movement. The ecumenical movement is basically a movement of the various denominations of the world that are seeing the need to, in love, come together as one. And thus we see denominations that are Christian and groups that are Muslim or Hindu, these various groups forming together. We call it that ecumenical movement. And again, it's putting into place the attitude that will be needed in order to form a one world church. And there will be this false prophet who will be leading that church. So let's talk then about that one world church. Revelation 13, it said, "And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and he makes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast." Jumping down to 16, "And he causes all, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, the free and the slave, to be given a mark on their right hand and on their forehead. And he provides that no one should be able to buy or sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name." Thus we see a worldwide worship it talked about, and back in the earth and those who dwell in it. So it's a one world church that's going to take place. And as we just mentioned, it will be led by that false prophet. And that false prophet will cause miraculous things to happen in order to prove that he truly is divine and that they should worship the Antichrist. I want to apply that to us today, because today we have both false prophets but also false teachers who are leading people astray. So I want to look at both the Old Testament and the New Testament as to how to identify these false teachers, these false prophets. We'll start by looking at the Old Testament. There are basically two tests that are given to us in the book of Deuteronomy as to how to identify a false prophet. The first one is that a false prophet is going to make a prophecy, and that prophecy does not come true. So if that happens, we know that that prophet is not from God. Let me read verse 22 of Deuteronomy 18. When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing does not come about or come true, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You should not be afraid of him. So the first test of a true prophet is that the prophecies that he makes come true. Now, if you notice, he's not speaking here that 60% or 70 or 90% of the prophecies come true. It talks about one. If a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord and the thing does not come about or come true, that thing, and thus he goes on to say that that prophet actually should be killed. There's a second test in the Old Testament. It's found in Deuteronomy 13. The second test is when the prophecy comes true that the prophet makes. But the prophet goes on and teaches false doctrine. Thus, not only do the actions, the miraculous actions and prophecies, yes, that is a good sign, but it is not the only sign. We must not only evaluate the signs, the miraculous prophecies, but we must also evaluate the teachings. Thus, the prophet in the end times looked like a lamb, and yet he spoke like a dragon. And thus he would be identified as a false prophet. Let me read Deuteronomy 13. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes true, just like taking an image and causing him to breathe and to talk. And yet he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods whom you have not known, and let us serve them. That's exactly what this false prophet in the time of the tribulation tells them to do, to worship the Antichrist rather than to worship God. Verse 3, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to find out if you love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. So these are the first two tests of identifying a false prophet. Does he make a prophecy that does not come true? Then he is a false prophet. And even if the prophecies that he makes come true, if he teaches false doctrine, then he is not a true prophet. Let's look at the New Testament. There are three things that are given to us in the New Testament to help us to identify false teachers, false prophets. Let me read these verses, and then I'll make those two of the comments, and then we'll look at the Matthew one. 1 John 4, beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. And this is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you have heard that is coming and is now. It is already in the world. So from these verses, we can get two tests for false teachers. The first had to do with who is Jesus. And normally it has to do with the Trinity, though there may be many others as well. But virtually all of the false teachers, the false cults, we call them, that are out there today, have a misunderstanding of the Trinity. They teach error concerning who Jesus is. And they also teach error as to what they need to do in order to be saved. And they're virtually all, again, some kind of a works salvation rather than salvation by faith alone. And thus, when we see these teachings coming from either a group or from an individual, we know that that is a false prophet. There's a third test that Jesus gave to us in Matthew chapter 7. It says in verse 16, "You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles, are they? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then, you will know them by their fruits." So the third test that's given to us for identifying a false teacher and a false prophet is to not only evaluate what they're saying about Jesus, their doctrine, but also we need to evaluate their lives. And are they living a life that is consistent with the teachings of the Word of God? Thus, we can even today identify false prophets. But a day is coming, that 70th week of Daniel, when the world will be deceived and will begin to worship the Antichrist. We'll go on next lesson and we'll talk about other areas of the tribulation time. Oh, God bless.